Mary Barrie was the wife of author and playwright Sir James M. Barrie. Mary was born Mary Ansell in 1861 in Paddington. She died Mary Cannan in 1945 or 1950 in Biarritz, France. Her story, full of twists, turns, art, and intrigue, has been neglected in favor of her husband J.M. Barrie's own story. So who was this woman who reinvented herself repeatedly? She was the third child of George and Mary Ansell, who ran and lived over the King's Head pub in Paddington. Ansell's father died in 1875, and the family moved to Hastings in Sussex. Ansell was solidly upper middle class and is depicted throughout her childhood and teenage years as well-dressed. This would potentially be a trend of Barrie's, that he was attracted to women of a higher social class than himself. Mary Ansell became acquainted with Peter Pan author and playwright Barrie in 1891 when he asked his friend Jerome K. Jerome, or Addison Bright, the story differs, for a pretty actress to play a role in his play Walker, London. The two became friends, and she joined the Barrie family, befriending his mother and sister and caring for him when he fell very ill in 1893 and 1894 from pneumonia and pleurisy. There is some question about this illness, that Barrie could have faked it to create panic in Mary, who had refused his offers of marriage prior. Regardless, she and Barrie married in Kirriemuir, also known as Thrums, Scotland, on July 9, 1894, shortly after his recovery, and she retired from the stage. The wedding was a small ceremony in his parents' home in the Scottish tradition, with his sister Sarah and his sister Isabella's husband, William, as witnesses. She was 33 years old, but the marriage certificate stated her age as 27. Barrie had an interesting relationship with women, with his mother openly preferring his dead brother David throughout his childhood. His hometown in Scotland grew to stability due to its weaving of fabric for women's corsets. As a child, he would have seen these corset shapes scattered around his weaver father's premises and wondered about the mysterious creatures that wore them. After they got married, the couple lived in London in a house near Kensington Gardens. In 1900, Mary found Black Lake Cottage at Farnham, Surrey, which became the couple's bolt hole, where he could entertain his cricketing friends and the Davies family. Mary may have wanted to decorate this home herself, but this task was quickly taken over by Barrie's semi-secretary at the time and friend of the family, Mrs. Elizabeth Lucas, wife of Barrie's publisher friend E.V. Lucas. Beginning in mid-1908, Mary had an affair with Gilbert Cannan, an associate of Barrie's in his anti-censorship activities, including a visit together to Black Lake Cottage, known only to the house staff. When Barrie learned of the affair in July 1909, he demanded that she end it, but she refused. In hopes of avoiding the scandal of divorce, Barrie offered her a legal separation if she would agree not to see Gilbert anymore, but she still refused. He sued for divorce on the grounds of infidelity, which was granted in October 1909 in London. In the course of the proceedings, Mary asserted that their marriage had never been consummated. In his will, Barrie left £1,000 plus £600 a year for life to my dear Mary Cannan, spelled incorrectly. Supposedly, this money was to be paid at an annual dinner held between them on their wedding anniversary. So was she really his dear? In Memories of Nico Llewellyn Davies, recorded by Andrew Birkin on the in-depth jmbarrie.co.uk website, Nico recalled driving with Barrie and spotting Mary Ansell in town. Barrie pretended he did not see her at all. Surely, if she was his dear, they would have had a conversation. Mary wrote about her passions in 3 books: Happy Houses, The Happy Garden of 1912, and Men and Dogs of 1924. In Men and Dogs, she recorded her memories with the St. Bernard puppy Porthos. She and Barrie had picked up on their honeymoon in Lucerne, Switzerland. Mary wrote, "I have never really been happy with people. They seem so unwilling to reveal their real selves. But with animals it is different. An animal is so helpless itself. I become one with them. I too become helpless myself. When dogs loved me, it was without forethought or afterthought. But men didn't love me unless they wanted to, unless I fitted in with their idea of me. Dogs just loved me with passion and warmth, without thinking about it. Speaking of men, Mary said, I only loved clever men, and clever men are made up of reserves. It is out of their reserves they bring their clever things. Men are complicated. Mary said of Porthos, Porthos loved his master more than he did me. I gave him medicine, kept him clean, and generally looked after him, but his master played with him and was a genius at games. In one memory of the book, she records Porthos being possessed by a devil. Was this the devil that seemed to have come alive in the Black Lake cottage photographs with the Llewellyn Davies boys? Nico Llewellyn Davies further remembered, I'll put it small time, she was devoted to all of us boys, and all of us 5 boys were devoted to her. The only time I can remember sort of vague, sort of 5-year-old things. She came down to his when he was dying, that J.M. Barrie, that is. I think he was just not conscious when she came to see him. We were at the nursing home where he did die. She was Cannan as she was then. She was absolutely exquisite to look at and very nice and very kind. Mary Ansell's second husband, Gilbert Cannan, was considered a promising novelist and playwright until his career was cut short by his increasingly unstable mental health. An unconventional man for his time, Cannan used his rich life experiences as inspirations for his writing. Here was the intersection of the Bloomsbury group in Cannan with Edwardian authors in Barrie. Born in Manchester, England on June 25, 1884, Cannan clashed with his family at an early age. He felt overshadowed by an older brother, which resulted in his often being physically ill and mentally frail. Barrie felt the same. In 1897, his family decided that he should live away from them with his cousin, the economist Edward Cannan, in Oxford. From that point forward, Gilbert Cannan spent all his holidays and free time at his cousin's home in Oxford. He studied modern and medieval languages at King's College, Cambridge. He later studied for the bar, but abandoned a legal career to concentrate on writing. His first commissioned piece was a translation of French author Romain Rolland's series of novels Jean Christophe from French into English in 1907. His political leanings and amateur acting led him to accept the position of secretary in the Society for the Abolition of Censorship. Through this organization, he became close friends with James Barrie and his wife, Mary Ansell. A search for this society leaves very little, but it appears to have established a branch in the United States which was more successful. An advocate of free love, Cannan eventually began a love affair with Mary Ansell, which was the inspiration for his first novel, Peter Homunculus, of 1909. Peter Homunculus, or Small Peter, is a play on words from Barrie's 1904's Peter Pan. Barrie himself was a homunculus, or diminutive man, 5 foot 3.5 tall, and Mary Ansell was about the same height. Cannan's book includes the description of an old man who thinks he can learn about life through reading. This man is the character Mr. Cooper, a bookshop owner, with his ever-present pipe, like Barrie, coughing, like Barrie, and his insults towards the main character, calling him a sloppy devil. He says things like, to be arrogant is to spoil the world, it is better for life to shatter dreams, and hurt is a small thing. He leaves his entire estate to the main character, which may have been a perverse hope of Cannan's. He seems to predict George Llewellyn Davies' death, saying a boy named George will die after reaching great heights because he became arrogant. George Llewellyn Davies would die in World War I in 1915. More offensive still, Cannan put Peter Davies, as in one of Barrie's wards, into the book, name and all as the main character. Mary Dugdale, the actress, appears to be Mary Ansell in this book, and she is rumored to be engaged to a much older man. She and Barrie were actually the same age, but many thought Mary was younger, which will be discussed later. The main character, Peter, moves from woman to woman seeking a mother. Some of the women are prostitutes. So an upper-class actress was quite the step up for Cannan and the main character. He kills her off about a third of the way through the book. Before doing so, here is Cannan's description of Mary, his enthroned goddess, in 1909. From the pit and gallery, Peter had often adored her. Her hair, bronze hair, clustered around her head, her brave walk, swift movements, gallant, her soft, kind voice so tender and so thrilling in its lower notes, her eyes beyond words beautiful, her nose so straight, and her mouth awry with the little dimples that chased upon her cheek as she spoke. He was proud that others should so speak of her, his rarest possession. She was more real to him than any of the beings with whom he came in contact. He never talked of her. He stayed now under the shelter of the portico and listened to her praises. Some talked of her as Mary. The familiarity jarred. That same year, the Stage Society produced his play Dull Monotony at a private performance. In 1910, Cannan married Mary Ansell after her divorce in 1909, which was granted by Decree Nisi due to the infidelity. Together, they moved to London from the English countryside in 1911, and Cannan began writing his first successful novel. Entitled Round the Corner, 1913, the novel was based on the life of his grandfather. In the spring of 1913, the two had moved to Hawridge Windmill, which is also known as Cholesbury Windmill, a disused tower mill in Hawridge, Buckinghamshire. It became a private residence in 1913 when Gilbert used it as a studio. The Cannans immediately set about decorating the mill house property in an avant-garde style and the mill tower into an impromptu studio. Land was acquired at the rear of the property to create a garden. They invited their many friends and acquaintances, many of whom were associated with two artists' groups, the Bloomsbury group and the lesser well-known London group, which were both prominent around the time of the First World War. The couple frequently invited so many of their friends to stay that it necessitated renting out neighboring cottages, including Dora Carrington, Adeline Morel, and you can spot Cannan in Morel's blue-paged scrapbook, Duncan Grant, Dorothea Brett, Edward Marsh, David Garnett, and Compton Mackenzie. D.H. Lawrence and his new wife Frida rented a cottage in nearby Bellington, and Catherine Mansfield and John Middleton Murray, who were having an affair at the time, lodged next door at the Gables before renting a cottage there 3 miles away at the Lee. In December 1914, the group were joined by Ukrainian writer S.S. Kotolansky and the painter Mark Gertler, and all spent a raucous Christmas partying in each other's houses. These and related events at Cholesbury were depicted in pictures or formed the basis of several subsequent accounts in letters, memoirs, and novels. This is according to Spartacus Educational and the wonderful Lynn's Waffles website. Although Cannan continued to produce plays and other works, they were not as well received as his work in 1913. In 1914, Cannan was a pacifist, and during the First World War, he was a conscientious objector, and he was involved in the National Council Against Conscription. Plagued by mental frailty his entire life, he suffered a major mental breakdown in 1917, from which he would never fully recover. Just before his breakdown, he fell in love with Gwen Wilson, a young South African girl, which led to his legal separation from Mary. In January 1917, Gilbert informed Mary that a woman they employed was about to have a child. Soon afterwards, maybe due to not having any children of his own, he became ill, broke down, and entered a nursing home, and in his absence, a love letter and a love poem arrived initialed G.W. Mary took these letters to her husband, who admitted they were from a Miss Gwen Wilson, whom he loved. Mary had been involved in the World War I Red Cross effort, wrapping bandages, and thereafter moved to France. The marital breakdown inspired Cannan's 3-act play Inquest on Perot, later shortened into Perot in Hospital, published in 7 Plays, 1923. After the war, Cannan devoted himself to writing, translation work, and travel, but another mental breakdown in 1923 proved untreatable. Back in 1917, Mary ceased to live with her husband. She was in straitened circumstances, as it was wartime, and there was no call for her direct decorative enamel work she had been creating in the disused windmill, which had started as a hobby and grew to become a good source of income for her. She had used her savings and the annual money she had been given through her divorce, and she had to sell Black Lake Cottage, which was initially bought in her name. She was working rolling bandages and packing medical supplies. Barrie was heavily involved in the Red Cross's start in Britain and likely helped her with that work as well. But in 1917, Barrie had heard about the marital calamity and wanted to give her some more financial help. On March 5th, 1917, he wrote to her, "My dear Mary, it would be silly of us not to meet, and indeed I wanted to go to you all day yesterday. I thought perhaps you would rather come here, and of course whichever you prefer, I prefer. But that is your only option, as I mean to see you whether the idea scares you or not. Painful in a way the first time, but surely it need not be so afterwards. How about coming here on Wednesday to lunch at 1:30? If you are feeling well enough, I wish you were doing war work. There must be posts you are so particularly fitted for. We could have some talk about that. All personal troubles outside the war seem so small nowadays. But just one thing I would like to say, because no one can know it so well as I, that never in this world could a young literary man have started with better chances than Mr. Cannan when he had you at the helm. Yours affectionately, J.M.B. Of course, J.M.B. had been personally affected by the war, with George Llewellyn Davies, his ward, dead on the front. In April 1917, in a fascinating role reversal from 1909, Mary had written to Gilbert asking him to return. "Will you not come back and live with me again?" she asked. He replied, "I have searched our problem from end to end, and it has become more and more clear to me that you and I cannot find together the sustenance without which no marriage can exist." What was their problem from end to end? Could it be the 20-year age difference between him and her? In October 1917, she obtained an order for restitution of conjugal rights. The court ordered Gilbert to return to his wife within 14 days. Divorce was so frowned upon. Then the respondent wrote, "The law apparently does not allow human beings to be human, and I propose therefore to bother the law by complying with it and returning to you." Evidence was given of Gilbert living with Miss Gwen Wilson at Elm Tree Road, St. John's Wood at the time. In April 1918, Mary was granted a decree of judicial separation on the grounds of the misconduct of her husband, Mr. Gilbert Cannan, the author. There was no defense. Gwen Wilson, who seems to have loved a bust of her and appears with it in many photographs, later married the politician Henry Mond in 1920 while Cannan was lecturing in the United States. Mond was the head of Imperial Chemical Industries and a hardcore Zionist. Unconventionally, Cannan lived with them in a menage a trois in their home, Mulberry House in Smith Square, Westminster. A hint of their relationship is suggested in Cannan's dedication of Letters from a Distance to Gwen, without whose courage, tenderness, and force there would have been no author to write these letters. He dedicated his book describing one of his mental breakdowns, The Release of the Soul, to her in 1920 as well. In Release of the Soul, he explores the destruction of the white races in the Great War, arguing that they sought something outside of conventional religion and found finance or an old god. He also argues that the superior man broods and dreams, but the mediocre man simply goes through the motions of living, and it is this mediocre man that comprises the majority of society. He argues what is needed is a technique, an individualistic technique, so everyone can put all of the passions of their own lives together. This was sort of radical writing under the roof of a globalist and may have caused strife. After World War I, Cannan continued to write, contributing articles to the New York Tribune and the New York Freeman. As time went on, however, his mental instability grew worse, and he had periods of intense paranoia, not helped by his residence with a married couple, one of whom was a politician and had people leaving and entering Mulberry House. Cannan was eventually certified insane at the request of his ailing mother and lived the rest of his life in asylums. He died in June 1955. He became a mental patient at the Priory Hospital, Roehampton. He then spent the rest of his life confined to Holloway Sanatorium near Virginia Water, where he died of cancer. I have requested records of Cannan's stay, but received nothing, likely due to the length of time that has passed. Let's turn back now to Cannan's wife. Like her mother, Mary, Ansell appears to have regularly shaved years off of her age. The Ansell family were still living at the King's Head Pub, 71 Moscow Road, Paddington, Middlesex, on the 7th of April, 1861, and Mary was just 1 month old. Her mother, Mary, was actually 40, but on the census it states she was 36, just a little fib. By 1871, Mary's age is correctly stated as 10 years. By 1881, it is correctly stated as 20 years. By this time, Mary was the only child living with her widowed mother at 113 Mount Pleasant Road, Hastings, Sussex. So her 3 brothers, George, William, and Thomas, have left home, and one appears to have entered service at Eton Hall. Mother Mary is described as being 50 years old by the census, but she was actually 60. Her occupation is described as income derived from houses. So maybe she had invested her money from a house at Elgin Road to produce herself an income and was living as a landlady. Mary did not have an occupation listed and may have been acting. Her first professional acting performance is listed in Easter 1890 with the Era. By 1891, there is no entry for Mary, and it's possible she was banging around London trying to figure out her way through acting. In 1891, Mary met J.M. Barrie. They were both 31. At this time, she had been on the stage playing small parts on an amateur level. She had used some family money to fund a touring company. She hadn't made much money from it, but she was being seen, and as a result, she was offered parts in London, which was exactly what she wanted. Her roles were small but individual. As well as a part in Harbour Lights, she played a part in Hamlet, another in Saratoga or Brighton. She was also a member of Norman Forbes's company at the Globe Theatre for a while. But a leading role in a J.M. Barrie play meant a great deal to her. That was the big time. Barrie was often at the Globe Theatre, both at rehearsals and during the run. He took a shine to Mary and escorted her to her lodgings. They dined out at fashionable restaurants. He liked being seen with a pretty girl, and many actresses wanted to be seen with him, including Mary Pickford years later, but Mary liked him for himself. He was a good listener. She confided in him her hopes and dreams of becoming a really good actress and making a name for herself. Their suppers became regular engagements, and on weekends they would drive out to Richmond Park or visit Sheer in Surrey or stroll in Kensington Gardens, which they both loved. Mary preferred driving much more than Barrie. She also enjoyed the countryside and gardens. In 1892, the fact that J.M. Barrie was not much over 5 foot didn't concern Mary, as she was barely 5 foot herself. Mary was no scintillating conservationalist, but she was intelligent, albeit rather provincial, and had a keen perception of Barrie's dour sense of humor. Barrie's notebooks for the spring and summer of 1892 are crammed with observations about himself and Mary Ansell, ostensibly for a novel under the working title of The Sentimentalists. Here are some of his notes. This sentimentalist wants to make girl love him, yet doesn't want to marry. First, her independence, hates herself as feeling it go. She pretends she doesn't want to marry him. She can't be sure he loves her. Her way of peering over her fur collar, which was immortalized in photographs, her ordering clothes for him, etc., motherly feelings. In 1892, Mary is given her first part in one of Barrie's plays, Walker London. In 1894, in July, they married. The marriage certificate incorrectly stated her age as 27, her real age was 33, a difference of 6 years. The newspaper report from the following day of marriage stated, at 12 o'clock, a small company of about 12 people, consisting of the relatives of Mr. Barrie and Miss Ansell, assembled in the drawing room of Strathview House to witness the marriage ceremony, which took place in the greatest privacy, so we are unable to give a list of guests. The Reverend David Ogilvy, Barrie's uncle, minister of Motherwell Free Church, perhaps Motherwell Cathedral, uncle of the bridegroom, assisted by Reverend William Livingston, South Free Church, which is the church the family attend, tied the wedding knot. There was neither a bridesmaid nor a groomsman, and the certificate was signed by Reverend Ogilvy, Mr. Winter, the bridegroom's brother-in-law, and Miss Barrie, his sister. After the bridal party had partaken of light refreshment, Mr. and Mrs. Barrie, with Miss Barrie and Mr. Winter, were driven in an open carriage and pair to Forfar, where they joined the train leaving at 2:57 p.m. for Edinburgh. The young wife, Mary, wore a light-colored dress and a beautiful boa of white feathers. Winter was the father of a chess champion whom Barrie hosted in his Adelphi Terrace apartment years later. In 1896, Mary was dealing with all of their money affairs. She paid checks into the bank, paid the bills, and it didn't matter if she was extravagant, as there were hundreds of thousands of pounds coming in from plays, books, newspapers. Their friend Thomas Lennox Gilmore, a barrister, invested surplus money for them, but Barrie hadn't paid any income tax and was in the habit of carrying around cash in his pockets. Not intentionally did he not pay any income tax, but he received a demand from the government and sought help from Gilmore, so thereafter Gilmore took on the complicated financial affairs. And Barrie was happy to leave this all to Marion Gilmore, who was turning his money into more money with sound investments. By September 1896, Mary and her husband made their first trip to America. They sailed from Liverpool on the Campania, arriving in October. Mary had bought a new wardrobe of the most fashionable clothes and looked forward to being received as the wife of a famous writer. As time went on, she became more snobby. Barrie wrote all of his thoughts and feelings down on paper that we know of, either in notebooks or in one of his works. One such was deleted on the page of one of his manuscripts. She lived so long after Tommy that she was almost a middle-aged woman when she died. What God will find hardest to forgive in him, I think, is that Grizel never had a child. With his typical aptitude, Barrie had predicted the future. Mary, indeed, would outlive him. From his novel, Tommy and Grizel, that was a reflection of his life with Mary, he wrote as he felt. He knew she wanted a child, and he would go to strange and great lengths to get children. In 1897, Mary came out of retirement briefly to play Babby, a gypsy, in a copyright performance to protect the author's dramatic rights in her husband's play, The Little Minister. This role would be popularized by Maud Adams, who you can learn about on this channel. In April 1900, Mary discovered Black Lake Cottage in Farnham, Surrey. It had a neglected garden and was surrounded by a pine forest. She bought the lease in her own name. Then she began transforming the house with builders and gardeners. Her husband wasn't so keen on the cottage until his Barrie cricket team gathered there for their annual match in the following July, and that changed his mind. By Christmas 1900, the couple were back in their home in Gloucester Road. Barrie had written a private pantomime that they were going to perform at home with their guests. In a letter, he wrote, "Mary is at present trying on her fairy costume." The pantomime was called The Greedy Dwarf and was performed just once in January 1901. Many friends took part. One visitor wrote, "We were dressed in our party frocks and drove to the house in Gloucester Road. We went into a room near the front door that was crammed with children. We were so excited. Mr. Gerald du Maurier was the dwarf, Mr. Barrie was a schoolboy, and Mrs. Barrie looked like a little girl and happy." You can learn more about the du Maurier family on this channel. Barrie's future biographer, Dennis McHale, who was 9 years old and present at the event, wrote, "Many of the children had never seen a play before and would never forget their afternoon. Here was richness, amazement, and silent joy. This enjoyment laid the foundation for Peter Pan, the play meant for children." By 1901, Mary's age incorrectly stated she was 34. Her real age was 40, that same difference of 6 years. By the summer of 1901, the couple were at Black Lake Cottage with the Llewellyn Davies family holidaying nearby. Barrie was besotted with the Llewellyn Davies boys, but they kept him happy, and she was happy that he wasn't getting into his depressive moods. With them in his life, he was warm and witty, according to Dennis McHale. Barrie had become a big success in America with his plays as well as in the United Kingdom by now. Public success was overshadowed late in 1901 by the Barries having to put their much-beloved Porthos dog to sleep. Mary wrote, "Buried with him were my first 7 years of married life." In 1902, the Barries held a cricket week, playing against Shackelford and Frensham. The garden was picture-perfect now, and Mary was an excellent hostess. Those that couldn't stay in the house were found rooms in Farnham with the Lanchesters transporting them. The friends went for walks, played croquet, tea on the lawn, and a good week was had by all. Thanks to the book by Robert Greenham about his family, we know that between 1903 and 1906, there were many famous guests at Black Lake Cottage, including Thomas Hardy, George Meredith, and Robert Falcon Scott of the Antarctic. Other visitors included the Llewellyn-Davies family. It was during this 1902 summer that Barrie wrote the precursor to Peter Pan, The Little White Bird, at Black Lake Cottage and in his study at his London home. In Christmas of 1902, the Barries went to Paris as a celebratory trip after the success of Barrie's new play and his finishing his very emotional book, The Little White Bird. Accompanied by mystery novelist and future MP Alfred E.W. Mason, Sylvia Llewellyn-Davies and a couple of her boys went too, leaving her husband Arthur behind in England. Apparently, they lived in great splendor while there and enjoyed themselves immensely. You can learn more about the strange and lonely death of Arthur Llewellyn-Davies on this channel. In 1903, Mary had decided on a new dog, and she found a black and white Newfoundland named Luath. I became a child with him, she wrote in her 1924 book, Dogs and Men. There is also a question of how much photography Mary did, if she took the photos of Barrie we know of with Luath, photos of him with his family in Scotland in the 1890s. In 1903, Mabel Llewellyn became the Barries' new housekeeper at the cottage. Her grandson, Robert Greenham, mentioned previously, has written about her time there in a biographical book, It Might Have Been Raining. In 1904, rehearsals for Peter Pan were going well. Security guards had to prevent journalists from sneaking into the theater, and only very few close friends were allowed. Mary made a few visits to the play, her husband rarely seeking her opinion now and instead relying on the boys and Sylvia Llewellyn-Davies. Actor Arthur Lupino played the Barries' dog in Peter Pan, Nana, and he had studied Luath's movements very carefully. Wanting to be supportive, Mary took Luath with Lupino to see specialists in Drury Lane, where they made a costume. They took a sample of Luath's thick, furry black and white coat and made a costume exactly like the original for the play. In December 1904, the Barries went with many friends to the first Peter Pan matinee. Mary and her husband barely communicated now, as she had been shoved out of his life by the presence of Sylvia Llewellyn-Davies and the boys, but she continued to support him in public. Mary Barrie was present at her mother, Mary Ansell's death, according to the death certificate and the local newspaper, which reported in January 1905 that Barrie was staying in Hastings at that time too, a local celebrity. Mary had registered her mother's death the day after she died on January 9, 1905 in Hastings. Apparently, Barrie had rode with his wife in their chauffeur-driven car to his wife's mother's funeral. By the time of the funeral, Barrie rarely traveled in the car. It was essentially his wife's form of transport. Mary Ansell had written about her mother in a letter to Peter Llewellyn-Davies in April 1941, around the time he was compiling his family history known as the Morgue. My mother was always in a position to have a house of her own and to give her children a good education, 2 of her sons being put into professions, one being a carpenter, and she always allowed me a small income until well after my marriage. Also, she was very much against my taking up a career, especially the stage. From my grandfather, I inherited £1,000, quite a lot of money back then, which enabled me to gain experience on the stage by taking my own company on tour. When I married Barrie, I gave up a profession very dear to me and in which I was making great headway. In Easter 1905, the Barries went on a trip to Normandy, France, and Sylvia Llewellyn-Davies and 2 of her sons went with. In 1905, Mary had found something to occupy herself other than interior design and gardening. After taking some training in fine handcrafts, she rented a studio in Kensington and started artistic enamel work. This gave her something to do. She didn't need the money. She spent a lot of her spare time at the studio when she wasn't traveling or visiting Black Lake Cottage, and of course this fed into the popular arts and crafts movement of the time. I have not been able to find any images of Mary Ansell's enamel work, but I would be very curious to see any. Between June and August 1905, Mary went on a motoring trip with her friend Molly Moore to France. Her husband spent the time at Black Lake Cottage, inviting Sylvia and the boys to stay. In 1908, the summer, Mary met Gilbert Cannan. He was appointed as secretary to Barrie's committee campaigning for the abolition of the censor in theater. In 1908, Barrie booked the Grand Hotel in Kos, Switzerland for a 3-week skiing holiday. Sylvia and her boys were invited, so was Mary, so was Gilbert Cannan. Barrie didn't notice the growing affection between Mary and Gilbert, so distracted was he by the Llewellyn Davies children, and she was still a very attractive woman, especially to a young Gilbert who was largely without his family. She had a slender figure and, of course, dressed beautifully in the latest fashion. During 1908, Gilbert was staying at Black Lake Cottage with the Barries. Mary had learnt to use a typewriter and was helping both her husband and Gilbert with their writing. They had many weekend parties too. Mary always made them a huge success, and she remained an excellent hostess. In July 1909, Barrie was working at Black Lake Cottage while Mary was in London with her enamels. Mr. Hunt, their gardener, decided to spill the beans about Mary and Gilbert after Mary had criticized him. The staff there had known about their affair since the previous November, when Mary and Gilbert stayed there alone. Barrie listened, collected his things, and took the next train back to their home in London to confront Mary. When she returned from her studio that afternoon, he told her, and she admitted it. She said she wished she had had the courage to tell him before, and she wanted a divorce. They went together to see their friend and solicitor, Sir George Lewis. She said she was in love with Gilbert. Her husband offered her a legal separation if she gave him up, but she refused. She was determined to marry him. It was a huge step to take: divorce, social scandal. H.G. Wells, one of Mary's friends, wrote, "Mrs. B is a woman with a woman's desires, which for many years she has controlled." What kind of desires? I hardly know how Barrie will fare, left to himself without some woman's care for him. In a letter Mary wrote in August 1909, he, Barrie, says he knows I would be happier with G.C. and that we ought to marry one moment and the next clamors for me. Anyhow, I am to have money, and that will help things somewhat, but I have no fear for my happiness, none at all. What was this money that Barrie promised? Was it hush money? Gilbert was also very much in love with Mary. In 1909, during the divorce hearing, Mary stated, "It is 7 years since we separated, and that does not spell happiness until 18 months ago." At the divorce hearing, a decree nisi was granted as a result of Mary's adultery with Cannan, and the decree was absolute granted in April 1910. This was a very painful time for Barrie, and he was very cognizant of the damage it could do to his career. And so he and some of his friends wrote to a number of newspaper editors asking them not to publish the story. Barrie, of course, got his start in journalism, and as a result, only 3 newspapers ran with the divorce story. During this time, Mary wrote to her friend and author, H.G. Wells, "The horror is over, and I am living a lonely life down here at Black Lake Cottage. G and I are to be separated until we marry in April. We are playing the game for the look of the thing, but it is very dull. I dig in my garden and write letters. This has damaged us a lot with the public, but our friends, well, they know better." Her dog Luath was her constant companion. She later acquired another dog, Sammy, who would appear in artwork with Cannan. As she wrote, in April 1910, she married Cannan. The marriage certificate stated her age as 41. Her real age was 49, a difference of 8 years. Cannan was 24. At some time during her life, Mary decided to reduce her age so as to remain in her 20s as much as possible. But why? She wasn't acting. What sort of pretense was she trying to keep, or was this something she had learned from her mother, who also fudged her years? Having possibly deceived Barrie from the time of their meeting in 1892 to the time of their marriage, and presumably having successfully deceived Barrie's minister uncle, Reverend David Ogilvy, Mary could have chosen to maintain the 6-year difference throughout their marriage to simply keep up appearances. Many biographies of Barrie talk about him falling for and marrying the lovely young actress, implying her young age. But the age difference was actually only 9 months, and this was known at least by Barrie's friend and biographer, Dennis McHale. The occasion of her marriage gave Mary the ability to shed a few more years. She may have done this to deceive Gilbert into believing that there was a prospect of them having one child. In 1911, Mary's age was incorrectly stated as 40. Her real age was 50, increasing the difference to 10 years. It would be another 10 years before the 1921 census to show whether Mary continued to shed years. But time caught up with her, and we know that Mary bore Cannan no children, and that she divorced him in 1918 following his adultery with Gwen Wilson. In 1912, it seems Barrie put both Mary's age deception and her relationship with Gilbert to good use when he wrote his play Rosalind, which is currently in the United States in a library in Texas. In the lead role, Mrs. Beatrice Page, a woman of London well into her 40s and an actress, is lodging at a seaside cottage and is about to be asked to return to London to play once more the part of Rosalind, a young woman in Shakespeare's As You Like It. There are numerous references to middle age, and Mrs. Page makes various comments concerning age, such as, "You should never ask an actress's age, and have you noticed there are no parts in them plays for middle-aged ladies?" Are these things that Mary actually said? Charles Roche, a well-educated young man, aged 23, calls at the cottage quite by chance and recognizes a picture of a young-looking woman, a woman by whom he had been recently smitten. Could Barrie have written Gilbert's novel about this in 1909? The woman is Beatrice, made up and in her performance as Rosalind. Charles is initially led to believe that Mrs. Page is Beatrice's mother, and Mrs. Page speaks to him as if she were, but after having actresses' age deceptions explained to him, as in these telling lines, "There is nothing for them between the ages of 29 and 60. Occasionally one of the less experienced dramatists may write a part, but with a little coaxing we can always make him say, 'She needn't be more than 29. And so, dear Charles, we have succeeded in keeping middle-aged women off the stage. Why, even Father Time doesn't let on about us. He waits at the wings with a dark cloth for us, just as our dressers wait with dust sheets to fling over our expensive frocks. But we have a way with us that makes even Father Time reluctant to cast his cloak. Perhaps it is the coquettish, imploring look we give him as we dodge him. Perhaps, though he is an old fellow, he can't resist the powder on our pretty noses. And so he says, 'The enchanting baggage, I'll give her another year.' When you come to write my epitaph, Charles, let it be in these delicious words, 'She had a long 29. Was Mary potentially hanging on to her age, threatening to go back to the theater during her marriage to Barrie? Charles comes to accept that Mrs. Page and Beatrice are really one and the same person, falls in love with her, proposes, and the two go off happily to London. In real life, in August 1908, on the day after he had met Mary Barrie and at age 23, Gilbert Cannan had written to the sculptress Kathleen Bruce, who had spurned him, "Mrs. Barrie suddenly began to talk to me like a mother. She really is a dear thing, and she seems to need a good deal of me. I feel the need and give gladly." It is no coincidence that Barrie chose Beatrice as the name of the character in his play, for in the light of his play and his knowledge of his former wife, it is interesting to compare and contrast the characters of Shakespeare's comic heroines, Rosalind in As You Like It, and Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. Barrie's Rosalind is doubly interesting because not only does the play seem to reveal that by the time of its creation, the playwright knew that Mary had deceived both him and Cannan over her age, but it was also prophetic. At one point in the play, we are told that Beatrice is at Monte Carlo, a place where people gamble, and later we learn that she was supposed to be spending a month in Biarritz. How strange that in February 1921, 9 years after this play was written, D.H. Lawrence should write to Mary Cannan, by then his friend for about 5 years, expressing disapproval of her gambling and advising her that it should not become a habit. Also around that time, in 1925, Mary left England permanently to live the rest of her life in Biarritz. In December 1936, a newspaper reported, when Sir James's special play for Elizabeth Berkner, The Boy David, was produced in London, Mrs. Cannan traveled from Biarritz to see it. Lately, she has been anxious about the state of Sir James's health. She had realized from his letters there was something wrong, and a telegram with the news summoned her to London. An elderly lady now, few people realized she was the inspiration of many of Barrie's characters. He repeatedly introduced the name Mary into his plays in recognition of his devotion for Mary Ansell, one-time actress, former wife, and finally true friend. What was wrong with Barrie that Mary had been able to pick up on it from his letters? Had he been hooked on morphine by this time by his caretaker and secretary, Cynthia Asquith, who would eventually receive the bulk of his estate, much to the surprise of his wards, the Llewellyn Davies children? In June 1937, the Evening Telegraph reported, "The passing of Sir James Barrie recalled his marriage many years ago. Few people remembered that he was married and that he had lived with his wife for 15 years before they separated, and the marriage was dissolved. His former wife is now Mrs. Cannan, and she came to London when she was notified that Sir James was lying seriously ill. Their romance and lifelong friendship had that piquant touch that one would expect from a man of the loving nature of Barrie. Even after their separation, he kept in touch with her and they corresponded regularly. At the time of their divorce, he surprised the court by declaring he was still in love with his wife. Since then, the public have known him as a solitary figure. During their years of estrangement, Sir James helped his former wife in many ways. He built for her the villa she occupies in Biarritz, France, Villa La Esquina, Rue Constantine, Biarritz, France, and from which she made a hurried departure when she learned of his illness. He never forgot her birthday, and gifts always arrived from him at Christmas. This friendship was one of the prized things in Barrie's life. His letters told her of his work and plans and ideas, and her replies were couched in that same spirit of friendship with help and advice. In September 1937, Sir James Barrie's will was read. He made a bequest of £1,000 and an annuity of £600 to my dear Mary Cannan with my affectionate regards. According to the story of J.M.B., in a letter written in April 1941, Mary wrote, "My dear Peter, my attention has been drawn to a statement by Mr. McHale in his book, The Story of J.M.B. It will be found at the top of page 186. The whole of this statement is a gross fabrication. My mother never kept seaside lodgings, so Barrie never stayed there or was ill there, and the pretty daughter could never have helped to look after him. Moreover, I never met J.M.B. until Walker London was being cast. Mr. Addison Bright, a mutual friend, was the means of bringing us together. After seeing me play in Brighton at the Criterion Theatre, J.M.B. arranged a meeting to ask me whether I would accept the part of Nanny. This was the beginning of our friendship and entirely rules out Mr. McHale's sordid Hollywood romance, which is an absolute lie from beginning to end. My mother was always in a position to have a house of her own and to give her children a good education, 2 of her sons being put into professions, and she always allowed me a small income until well after my marriage. Also, she was very much against my taking up a career, especially the stage. There is another statement entirely incorrect. The first time I went to Caramure was when J.M. was dangerously ill. His sister Maggie, who I had previously met, sent me an urgent telegram to come, and I started for Scotland the same night. I arrived at the house the next morning and was taken at once to his room where I found 2 trained nurses in attendance. He was only half conscious, but managed to smile feebly as he said, "So you've got to Thrums." When he was well enough, we were married by his uncle, Dr. Ogilvy, and left for a London hotel at once. Again, he was taken ill, and it was Lady June, afterwards Lady St. Helier, in the great tenderness of her heart, for which we could never be sufficiently grateful, who carried us to her home in Harley Street, where we stayed for a week before going to Switzerland on honeymoon. These are the true facts of the case. I want now to know what you and Mr. McHale propose to do to put the matter right. I ask that a correction be put into the 4 leading London daily papers and that the offending text be deleted from the book. It is not for me to criticize this work. It is certainly not the J.M. that I knew for 16 years. Mr. McHale has cloaked him so heavily with petty meannesses and snobbery that very little of the real man is seen. But he had a fine spirit and great dignity. His tragedy was that he knew that as a man he was a failure, and that love in its fullest sense could never be felt by him or experienced, and it was this knowledge that led to his sentimental philanderings. One could almost hear him, like Peter Pan, crowing triumphantly, but his heart was sick all the time. There was so much tragedy in his life that Mr. McHale has ignored, tragedy not to be treated humorously or lightly. Mr. McHale has a passion for the word little, and after a time it becomes boring. I would suggest that it should be placed on the title page and left there. Wow, how much did she love her ex-husband to pen such a passionate defense? In responding to this letter to F.G. Howe, Peter's legal man at Peter Davis Limited, Dennis McHale pointed out that Mary Cannan had refused to cooperate with the writing of the biography in any way on the grounds that Barrie would not have wished any biography to be written at all. This is true. Was Mary afraid of Barrie's curse? Barrie publicly cursed anyone who published a biography of him. In the absence of Mary's first-hand information, he had been obliged to gather details of her background from other contemporaries, namely Irene Vanberg, C. M. Lown, C. Seymour Hicks, and Sir Arthur Quiller Couch. I might add, wrote McHale, that all these witnesses disliked Mrs. Cannan very much indeed. He concluded she isn't nearly as loyal to J.M.B. as she now pretends. She was bitter and appallingly outspoken at one time, and a number of people who knew her have told me that I have treated her in the book with great mercy and kindness. I should have thought that Mrs. Cannan would have preferred me not to dwell on the physical side of Barrie's marriage, and anyhow, Lady Cynthia Asquith, wouldn't let me mention it. As for my treatment of J.M.B., I just don't agree with her. Mr. Howe visited Mary Cannan on several occasions, and in the end, she withdrew her demands for an apology. Why? No correction was made to the biography in either British or American edition. This may suggest the influence Cynthia Asquith of the Prime Minister Asquith family had over the entire affair. The address that Mary wrote the letter to Peter from was the home of Alfred F. B. Knight and the family, and he was born in 1892. He became a civil servant of Inland Revenue in the 1939 Register. If he was still at that address in 1941, it's possible he was Mary's accountant or legal representative. By the 1940s, she was still corresponding with the Llewellyn Davies boys. She mentions in 1941 J.M.B.'s illness, J.M.B. is J.M. Barrie, and their marriage. This has been already said. Finally, it seems Mary deceived the authorities even in death. She died in Biarritz, France, on the 30th of June, 1950, although some state she died in 1945. Her death certificate gives the year of her birth incorrectly as the 1st of March, 1869, not 1861. She had continued to live the lie and had deceived many throughout her life. One has to remember these are years within living memory, and it would be wonderful to learn more about Mary Ansell and her single life in France. The contents of her house, Villa La Esquina, Rue Constantine, was auctioned off to the public. I can find no reminiscences or recollections of anyone who got their hands on her jewelry or her marvelous coat with the fur trim which she peeked out over.